The road to Wexford Hall did not announce itself with grandeur. It arrived through a corridor of bare ash trees, their pale bark stripped of autumn's last color, the lane so deeply rutted that the post-chaise shuddered and lurched with every wheel turn. Inside the carriage, Agnes Hartwell held the rim of the door with both hands and watched the gray sky scroll past the window and told herself, as she had told herself for the 3 weeks since her father died, that she was not afraid. She had been afraid before. She knew how to carry it. She was 28. She had been a lady's maid for 6 years, first to her mother's old friend, Mrs. Pemberton of Bath, and then, after that gentlewoman's decline, to any household willing to engage a woman of good manners, but no references beyond a dead woman's letter. In her traveling bag, wrapped in a handkerchief, was the only thing she had taken from her father's house on the Ludlow Road. A small, worn miniature of her parents on their wedding day. The paint rubbed thin at the edges, the kind of thing a man carries in his breast pocket until it becomes part of his body. She was traveling now on the strength of a single advertisement and a single reply, both conducted through a solicitor who had been kind enough not to ask what had become of her previous position. The advertisement had specified a lady's maid for Wexford Hall, Shropshire. The reply had specified a wage she could not refuse and a start date she could barely meet. What the advertisement had not specified was whose household she was entering. She had not thought to ask. That was the truth of it, the plain, embarrassing truth. And she could not look at it directly even now. She had been too desperate, and desperation had made her careless in precisely the way she could not afford to be careless. She was the daughter of a country curate. She knew better. She had simply not known better when it mattered. The carriage stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. With an abruptness that threw her forward and drove her knee against the opposite seat. She heard the coachman shout. Then a sound she could not immediately name. A crash. Something heavy and hollow, followed by the frantic clatter of hooves. And then, beneath those sounds, another. A woman's voice, high and sharp, cut off into silence. Agnes did not think. She opened the carriage door herself. The scene outside assembled itself in pieces. A market cart lay on its side in the lane, one wheel still spinning. A farm horse stood trembling at the edge of the verge, a young boy of perhaps 12 at its bridle, his face white to the lips. Beside the cart, in the road's loose mud and gravel, a woman of perhaps 50 lay awkwardly, one arm at an angle that made Agnes's throat close. And between the cart and the horse, braced against the shafts to prevent the wagon's full weight from completing its roll, was a man she had never seen before. He was not dressed as a laborer. She registered that even in the first half-second, the dark-fitted coat, the high collar and white cravat, the boots that were meant for another sort of road entirely. He had his shoulder against the cart's underside, and his heels driven into the gravel, and his face was turned away from her, showing only a jaw set so hard it might have been stone. "Take the wheel," he said. He did not look up. He did not know she was there. "The left wheel, where the spoke has caught the gatepost. It needs to turn back 6 inches. I cannot hold this indefinitely." Agnes moved before she finished understanding what he had said. She got both hands around the wheel's rim and pulled, and something in the mechanism released, and the man straightened. The cart settled. The horse stopped trembling. Only then did he turn. He was perhaps 33, possibly a little older. Dark hair. A face that was striking in a way she did not immediately have words for. Not handsome in the conventional soft sense, but specific. Each feature placed with an authority that made the whole unmistakable. His eyes were gray and cool and currently assessing her with an expression that had no warmth in it and no dismissal either. Simply attention, directed and complete. Then he saw her dress. It was a neat dress. It was, in the vocabulary of what Agnes could afford, presentable. It was not a guest's dress. The collar was cut simply. The fabric had been altered twice, and altered well, but the alterations were visible to anyone who looked with the right eye. She saw him see this, and she felt the familiar adjustment, the social recalibration, the small downward revision of who she was and what she warranted. And she lifted her chin 1/4 inch because that was all she allowed herself. He said, "Are you injured?" "Not who are you? Not who is your mistress? Simply, were you injured?" "No," she said. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had expected, and went to the woman on the ground. The woman in the lane was a farmer's wife, returning from the market at Ludlow with her grandson. Her name was Mrs. Price. She had broken no bones, as it turned out, though her wrist was badly wrenched and she was badly frightened, and the cart needed 2 men from the nearest farm to right it properly. The man in the dark coat sent the boy for help with a single quiet instruction and stayed until the men arrived. He said almost nothing during the half-hour they waited. He stood at a slight distance and watched without appearing to watch, and Agnes did what she could for Mrs. Price's wrist with a strip torn from her own petticoat, which she did privately and without ceremony. She was tying off the binding when she heard him say, very low, "That will do well." She did not look up. She was not sure he had meant her to hear it. When the farm men came and the cart was righted, and Mrs. Price was settled with her grandson in a more stable seat, Agnes walked back to the post-chaise. The coachman had climbed down to assess whether a wheel had been damaged, and she stood at the carriage door while he muttered and crouched. The man in the dark coat paused beside his own horse, which a groom had held throughout at a careful distance. He had taken his gloves from his coat pocket. She had not noticed him remove them in the first moments, though she supposed he must have, and was drawing them back on. He was not looking at her. Then he was. "You are traveling to Wexford Hall," he said. It was not a question. Agnes went still. "I am, sir." He looked at her for one moment that was slightly longer than courtesy required. Then he said, "I thought as much," and mounted and was gone up the lane at a controlled canter before she had time to respond. She stood in the road with mud on her hem and a strip missing from her petticoat, watching the dark coat disappear between the ash trees. The coachman pronounced the wheel sound. She climbed back inside. It was only then, jolting up the final 1/4 mile, that she noticed it. She had seen his coat through the carriage window when he first rode past and had not looked carefully. In the lane, at close range, with the light falling at the right angle, she had seen the small embroidered crest on his coat's breast pocket, though she had not stopped to read it. Now, in the archive of her memory, she turned it over. She knew that crest. Every child raised in a curate's house in Shropshire knew it. The 3 running hairs above the single chevron, the motto she had heard her father quote once from a county history. It was the crest of the Earls of Wexford. The carriage came around the last bend of the lane, and the hall rose ahead of her, gray stone, long and symmetrical, a great house in the morning light, and Agnes Hartwell understood, very slowly, that the stranger who had held a cart off a woman's legs in the mud of the road was the man whose household she had come to serve. This was how the season found her, without armor, without introduction, without the benefit of understanding whose floor she was about to walk. If you have stayed this far, I think you already know this is not a story that will resolve quickly. Stay with her a little longer. The hall was larger than she had prepared herself for. Not that she was unprepared for great houses. She had served in Mrs. Pemberton's establishment on the Circus in Bath, which was fine enough and orderly enough, and had a servants' hall that ran with clockwork efficiency. Wexford Hall was something different, older, more serious, the stone darkened to near black at the north face, the windows tall and evenly spaced, and filled with a gray that was their own, not the sky's. It sat in its grounds as though it had always been there, and intended to remain forever, and the permanence of it pressed on Agnes's chest in a way she could not fully account for. The housekeeper who admitted her was a woman called Mrs. Thorne, precise, economical in speech, not unkind. She showed Agnes to the room assigned to the lady's maid, which was small but warm, and looked onto the kitchen garden. And she explained, in the same efficient voice she might use to describe the laundry schedule, that she would be engaged to attend Lady Philippa Rowan, the Earl's younger sister, age 21, who was in residence at the Hall through the winter season before her presentation the following spring. "And the Earl himself?" Agnes said. "Is he in residence?" Mrs. Thorne looked at her steadily. "His lordship is in residence, yes. He returned this morning. You may expect to encounter him occasionally in the public rooms of the house, as is natural. He does not require attendance from the lady's maid." She said this with the perfect evenness of a woman who has said it before, and Agnes understood that she had been warned without being told what she was being warned about. Lady Philippa turned out to be exactly as complicated as Agnes had privately feared. Beautiful in a careless, unfinished way, intelligent in flashes, deeply bored, and possessed of the conviction, common among young women of her station who had spent too long in the country, that the established social rules were a kind of game that other people played. She greeted Agnes with a directness that might have been warmth, or might have been an evaluation, and she said within the first quarter hour, "You are far too sensible for a lady's maid." "What were you before?" "A lady's maid," Agnes said. Philippa laughed. It was a genuine laugh, and Agnes allowed herself the smallest adjustment in the set of her shoulders. The afternoon passed in the ordinary negotiations of a new position. The wardrobe inventory, the hair, Philippa's was dark and difficult, with a mind of its own. The schedules, the names of the other principal servants, and which of them were to be trusted on which subjects. Agnes was good at this. She had always been good at the practical business of a household, at understanding quickly where the weight was distributed, and what she could rely on, and what she could not. She moved through Wexford Hall's upper corridors with her eyes open and her expression composed, and she did not think about the man in the dark coat. She did not think about him until dinner, when Philippa mentioned him. "My brother is very severe," Philippa said, examining a brooch in the dressing mirror with the concentration she gave to anything that might later be used as ammunition against the world's expectations. "Do not take it as a judgment on your character. He is severe with everyone. He has been severe with everyone since." She paused. The pause was slightly too long to be natural. "Since the business with Clarissa. You will hear about Clarissa eventually. Everyone hears about Clarissa eventually. I would rather you heard a plain version of it from me." Agnes was standing behind her, working pins into the back of her hair. She said nothing. This was the correct response. "His wife," Philippa said. "She died 4 years ago. She was delivered of a child that did not survive, and she did not survive it either. He was not home. He was in London, at some parliamentary committee, and by the time the writer found him, it was already over." She set the brooch down. Her face in the mirror was very still. He has never said, to anyone, whether he blames himself. He does not need to say it. It is visible in everything about him. Agnes thought of gray eyes and an expression that had no warmth in it. "The house has a steward and a solicitor and a full complement of servants," Philippa continued. "It does not have a mistress, and my brother has refused every suggestion that he seek one. Lady Danforth, she is our mother's cousin, and she considers herself the family's guardian, has sent 3 young women of impeccable family to visit Wexford Hall in the past 2 years. He has been civil to every one of them, and has not written to any of them afterward." She looked at Agnes in the mirror now, directly. "You are probably wondering why I am telling you this." "No," Agnes said carefully. Philippa smiled. It was a sharp, quick smile, more like her brother than she probably knew. "Because I think you are the most perceptive person I have encountered in 6 months, and I am tired of being surrounded by people who agree with me." She turned back to the mirror. "That is all. Do not make it strange." Agnes finished her hair and said nothing, and went to bed that night with the accumulated weight of the day and a name that now belonged to a grief rather than a title. Clarissa. She had known she was entering a household shaped by loss. She had not known the particular shape of it. She did not sleep well, and the next morning she was early to the kitchen garden. Out of habit. Her father had kept a garden, and she had always thought better in one, among the ordered rows of it, and she was standing in the frost at the far end, looking at the bare kitchen beds and the gray winter light over the wall, when she heard the gate open behind her. She did not turn immediately. She did not need to. "You are up early," the Earl of Wexford said. "I wake early, my lord," she said. She turned then, because it would have been strange not to. He was dressed for riding. He stood in the gateway of the kitchen garden with his hat in his hand. He had apparently removed it, which was a courtesy she had not expected. And he looked at her across the width of the frosted beds with the same assessing gray attention she had encountered on the road. "I did not have the opportunity yesterday," he said, "to learn your name." "Agnes Hartwell, my lord. Miss Hartwell." He turned the hat once in his hand. "You bound Mrs. Price's wrist very competently." "I have some experience with minor injuries," she said. "My father was a country curate, and country curates are called on for everything short of the surgeon." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but the first intimation that warmth was a thing his face was capable of. "Your father was a clergyman?" "He died in September." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Agnes, who had learned to read silences, registered this as unusual. "I am sorry," the Earl said. It was a plain sentence, plainly meant, no elaboration, no social decoration, just the statement, aimed directly at her. "Thank you," she said. He stood in the gateway a moment longer. The frost was thick on the kitchen beds between them. Then he said, "Walk carefully in the south corridor on your way to Lady Philippa. The 3rd flagstone from the east door is loose. The steward is attending to it this week, but it has not been attended to yet." He put his hat back on and went out through the gate, and Agnes stood in the frost and breathed very carefully for a moment before going inside. She knew, because she was 28 and not 17, that a man mentioning a loose flagstone to a woman was not a declaration. She knew that an earl's courtesy to a maid in the kitchen garden was precisely that, courtesy, and that the social distance between them was real and specific, and not diminished by a moment of it. She also knew what she had heard in his voice just then, and she did not permit herself to name it. There followed 3 weeks that Agnes would later think of as the most complicated of her life, and not because anything large happened in them. The largeness was in the small things, the grain-by-grain accumulation of them, each of which she tried to examine rationally, and each of which resisted her examination. Lord Wexford did not attend to her in any way that could be called improper. He did not single her out in the presence of others. He did not speak to her in the public rooms of the house, where it would have been noticed and remarked on, and he did not cross the social line between his station and hers in any visible way. He was exactly what an earl was expected to be in his own household. He was removed, deliberate, present only in the large formal gestures of authority. But he noticed things. She observed him noticing things. He noticed when the candles in the library were replaced before they had guttered. She had asked the housemaid to replace them after she had been in to fetch a book for Philippa, and found the room dim and close, and he said nothing about it. But the following evening the housemaid told her, with a slight air of puzzlement, that his lordship had asked whether the lady's maid had requested the new candles. He noticed when she quietly redirected a delivery of hot water to Lady Philippa's room at an hour when the normal routine had been disrupted, and when she managed, on an afternoon when Philippa was in a state of elaborate theatrical misery about the Shropshire weather, to locate the book Philippa had left at Mrs. Thorne's end of the house and have it back in her hand within 7 minutes. Small things, invisible to anyone who was not watching for them. She did not know he was watching for them until the afternoon she found the loose flagstone in the south corridor had been replaced 3 days ahead of the steward's schedule, and Mrs. Thorne mentioned, in the tone of someone imparting neutral information, that his lordship had asked the matter be attended to promptly. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking around her, in the indirect grammar of the household, in the language of instructions to stewards and housemaids and the timing of small domestic repairs. She understood this, and she did not permit herself to feel anything about it. And she failed at not feeling anything about it, with a consistency she found alarming. Lady Danforth arrived on the 14th day of December, with a niece. Agnes was informed of the visit in the morning by Mrs. Thorne, who delivered the information with the same careful neutrality she brought to everything. The niece's name was Miss Vivian Fox. She was from a good Shropshire family. She was 22 years of age. She was recently come into a handsome portion following her uncle's death, and she was precisely the kind of young woman Lady Danforth had been deploying at Wexford Hall for 2 years. Agnes gathered all of this from Mrs. Thorne's 2-sentence summary and from the expression on Philippa's face when she heard the carriage arrive. "The campaign continues," Philippa said, at the window of her room, watching the arrivals in the court below. Her voice was dry, but Agnes could hear something underneath the dryness. "Lady Danforth will put Vivian in the drawing room every evening. She will arrange the seating at dinner so that Vivian is beside my brother. She will remark, at least twice, on Vivian's musical accomplishments and her knowledge of estate management and her very suitable portion. And my brother will be civil and attentive and entirely absent." She paused. "He is always civil and attentive and entirely absent." Agnes said nothing. Her hands were occupied with a length of ribbon she was trimming to the right measure, and she kept her eyes on her work. "You are very quiet," Philippa said. "That is my function," Agnes said. Philippa turned from the window. She looked at Agnes with an expression that was too knowing for Agnes's comfort, and said, "He asked Mrs. Thorne your name this morning, before he knew Danforth was coming." Agnes set the ribbon down. "He asked my name the first morning I was here, in the kitchen garden." "Yes, I know," Philippa said. "That is not why I mentioned it." Agnes picked the ribbon back up and said nothing, which was the only sensible response, and Philippa turned back to the window, and the subject was not revisited. Dinner that evening was what Philippa had predicted. Lady Danforth was a woman of perhaps 60, upholstered in confidence and dark velvet, who moved through a room with the authority of someone who had never seriously been questioned on anything that mattered. She had strong opinions on the management of great houses, on the proper conduct of a young woman's season, and on the particular requirements of the Earl of Wexford, which she discussed in the hearing of 3 other guests as though the Earl were a problem of domestic management rather than a person. Miss Vivian Fox sat beside him at dinner, and she was beautiful and well-spoken and entirely correct in everything she did and said, and she smiled at Lord Wexford with the practiced warmth of a woman who had been told all her life that she was the right answer to every question. Agnes was not at dinner. She ate in the servants' hall and sat with Mrs. Thorne and the head footman and a housemaid called Jenny, who was very young and very earnest, and she listened to the sounds of the upper house and felt the evening go on above her in the way she had learned to feel an entire household's weather through the walls and floors of it. She was in the upper corridor with Philippa's shawl, which had been asked for and was needed before the guests withdrew, when she passed the drawing-room doorway. She did not stop. She was not supposed to stop. But Lady Danforth's voice carried, and the door was not fully closed, and Agnes heard, quite clearly, the 3 words the older woman spoke in the momentary silence between 2 other conversations. "A maid, Philip," Lady Danforth said. "A maid, and a curate's daughter, at that." Agnes walked on. She did not stop walking. She did not adjust her pace. She delivered the shawl to the small sitting room at the corridor's end, where Philippa had gone for a moment's peace, and she gave no outward sign that she had heard anything, because she had been a lady's maid for 6 years, and she knew how to give no outward sign. But her hands, when she smoothed the shawl over Philippa's shoulders, were not entirely steady. "What is it?" Philippa said. "Nothing," Agnes said. "Nothing." Philippa was quiet for a moment. Then, very evenly, she said, "What did she say?" Agnes considered lying. It would have been the reasonable thing, the sensible thing, the thing that preserved the distance she had been maintaining for 3 weeks with considerable effort and no small cost. She looked at the window, at the dark glass and the frost on its outer edge, and thought of her father in his garden, who had always said that the truth, spoken cleanly, rarely did as much damage as the truth, left to fester in silence. "She named my position and my father's," Agnes said. "That is all." Philippa's face went very still. "In front of him?" "I do not know. I was passing the door." Philippa said nothing more. Agnes returned to her room and sat in the chair by the window and did not cry, because crying was not something she permitted herself for things that were simply true. She was a maid. Her father had been a curate. These were facts. Lady Danforth had not lied. Danforth. The trouble was not the facts. The trouble was the way the facts had been deployed, and who they had been deployed in front of, and the particular quality of the silence that had followed them on the other side of the drawing-room door. She was careful, after that, in a way she had not needed to be careful before. She stayed out of the rooms where the guests gathered. She confined herself to the upper corridors and the small domestic routes between Philippa's room and the back of the house. She was in no way avoiding the Earl. She told herself this with some conviction. She was simply exercising the discretion appropriate to her position. She believed this until the 3rd morning of the visit, when she came to the library to return the book she had finished. She had borrowed it with Philippa's encouragement, and on the tacit understanding that the library was available to her in the early morning hours before the household rose, and found Lord Wexford already there. He was at the writing desk at the far end of the room, his back partially turned, working through what appeared to be an estate correspondence. He did not look up when she entered, and she took 1 step backward, intending to retreat, and the floorboard spoke. He looked up. She held the book in both hands and said, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I did not know the room was engaged." "It is not engaged," he said. "Come in, Miss Hartwell." She came in. She moved to the shelf where the book belonged, returned it with the care she always gave to borrowed things, and was preparing to leave when he said, without looking up from his papers, "She has said it twice, in the upper drawing-room and at yesterday's breakfast. Mrs. Thorne tells me you have been careful to be elsewhere since." Agnes stood very still. "I have been attending to my duties." "Yes." He set down his pen. He turned to look at her, and his face was its usual collected self, the gray eyes steady and cool. "You are not required to make yourself invisible in my house, Miss Hartwell." She thought of 3 weeks of loose flagstones and replaced candles and early morning kitchen gardens. She thought of a woman's voice saying a maid, Philip, and the particular quality of the silence that had followed. "I am aware of my position," she said. Her voice was exactly level. "I do not need to be reminded of it, and I do not believe I have given any cause for. I am not reminding you of your position," he said. The words came out quietly and with a precision that made her stop. "I am telling you that Lady Danforth does not speak for this house." The room was very quiet. The fire in the library's grate was low, still building from the morning's tending, and the light was the thin gray of early December. She looked at him for a moment. That lasted slightly longer than she intended. He did not look away. His face was still composed, still deliberate, and there was nothing in it that she could have named to anyone as a declaration, nothing improper, nothing that crossed the line between his rank and her station. There was something underneath the composure that she recognized, in the same way she had recognized the loose flagstone's repair, and she thought, quite clearly, with the part of her mind that was honest even when the rest of her was not. "He means this," she said. "Thank you, my lord," and left the library. She walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window there and looked at the frost on the park and breathed until the breathing was reliable again. She was a maid. She was a curate's daughter. She was 28 and she had not slept well in 3 weeks. And she had heard, in the voice of a composed man at a writing desk, something she had stopped expecting to hear. She did not permit herself to name it. Not yet. It was the portrait that changed everything. She found it by accident. On the afternoon Lady Danforth and Miss Fawkes were out visiting a neighboring family, and the house was briefly, gratefully, quiet. She was returning a pair of Philippa's gloves to the upper room where Lady Danforth's visit had necessitated their removal, and she passed the door of the small gallery off the north staircase, a room she had not been in, a room Philippa had not mentioned. The door was ajar. She would not have looked in, except that the light was coming through the gallery window at an angle that caught the gilt frame of the nearest painting and threw a line of gold across the door's edge, and she turned her head without quite meaning to. The portrait was of a woman. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair dressed in a fashion that placed the painting 7 or 8 years in the past. She was sitting in a chair in a garden setting, and she was looking at something just outside the painting's frame with an expression of such open, unguarded happiness that Agnes felt the intrusion of it, even from the doorway. She did not go in. She did not need to go in to see the plain gold letters on the small plaque at the frame's lower edge. Clarissa Ann Rowan, Countess of Wexford, 1806. Agnes stood in the doorway for one breath. Then she walked on. She understood things differently after that. She had understood them in her mind before. But the portrait had given them a different register. The open, unguarded face of a woman the Earl had loved, and failed to be present for at the end of, and had been carrying ever since in the particular silence of a man who does not speak of what he has lost, because speaking would require him to locate the full size of it. She understood why he did not entertain Lady Danforth's introductions. She understood the portrait turned to face the wall in his study, which she had never seen, but which Philippa had mentioned once in passing. She understood the way he looked at her sometimes, not with admiration, not with longing, but with something more careful than either. The attention of a man who has learned to look precisely at what is actually there, rather than at what he needs it to be. She understood that she was in considerable difficulty. Not because of anything improper, not because of anything he had said or done or even suggested. simply because she was 28, and her father was dead, and she had lived for 3 weeks in a house where a man had noticed her with the quiet specificity of someone who was not performing notice for an audience, and this had undone something in her that she had spent 6 years carefully maintaining. She was in the kitchen garden again the next morning, because it was where she thought best, and she needed to think. And she was standing at the far wall, looking at the frost on the kitchen beds when she heard the gate. She did not turn. "Miss Hartwell," Lord Wexford said. "My lord," she said. She turned. He looked like a man who had come somewhere with something specific in mind and had thought better of it, and was recalculating. He was in his outdoor coat. He was not wearing his hat, which was unusual, and she thought privately that this was probably significant in the way that small departures from the ordinary were always significant in a man whose ordinariness was itself a kind of discipline. "Lady Danforth departs tomorrow," he said. "I know," Agnes said. "I wanted to speak to you before she left," he said. "Because it is easier to speak without the context of her visit in the room, and I have been waiting for the easier moment, which I have come to think may not arrive on its own." Agnes was very still. The frost lay thick on the kitchen beds between them. She thought he was going to tell me something I am not ready to hear. She thought she had been not ready for 3 weeks. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that there is a distance between us that propriety requires, and that I am not the appropriate person to suggest that this distance should close. I am also aware that what I am about to say may be the most irregular thing I have said to anyone in 4 years, and I ask you to understand that I have said it anyway, because I am not willing to not say it." She breathed. "I would like," he said, "to know whether you are planning to remain at Wexford Hall past the spring." She looked at him. He looked back. His face was entirely composed, and she had learned, by now, to read past the composition. "That depends," she said, "on a number of things." "Yes," he said. "I thought it might." Silence. The frost, the bare winter beds. He was 3 feet from her, which was not a small distance, and somehow the 3 feet were different now than they had been on the first morning. "My lord," she said, with the care of someone measuring each word before placing it, "I am not unaware of what you are suggesting, and I would not say that it is unwelcome." She stopped. She tried again. "But I am not able to be a project. I am not able to be someone's correction of a past mistake, or someone's argument against Lady Danforth, or a proof of anything. If there is a reason to be here beyond my position, it must be its own reason." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted, and it was the shift she had been watching for. The one that showed what was underneath the gray composure. The one that looked very much like something fragile and real. "It is its own reason," he said. "I am not eloquent about it. I have not been eloquent about anything of importance in 4 years. It is its own reason, and it has been its own reason since you put your hands on a cartwheel in a lane and told me you were not injured in a tone of voice that suggested injury was not a state you were accustomed to admitting." She thought of the road and the upended cart and the first gray assessment of his eyes. "I am 28, she said. "I am a maid in your household. I am the daughter of a country curate. These things are true." "Yes," he said. "I know. Lady Danforth will say so again. Others will say so." "Yes," he said. "I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. There was nothing in his posture of a man trying to persuade, nothing of a man waiting to be praised for his broad-mindedness. He looked, instead, like a man who had come to the kitchen garden because he had something specific to say, and had said it, and was now simply present, waiting for whatever came next. "Then I would stay," Agnes said quietly, "if the position were offered." He stood in the gateway of the kitchen garden with no hat on and frost on the ground between them, and he nodded once, slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had carried at some cost for a considerable time. "It is offered," he said. She lifted her chin 1/4 inch. She could feel the cold in her face and the pulse at her wrists and the particular quality of the air in a moment that cannot be unmade. "Then I accept," she said. They were in the kitchen garden, in the frost, in the thin gray light of a December morning. There were 3 feet of frosted earth between them, and a household above them, and a social order that would have opinions about everything that was going to follow. He stood in the gate, and she stood at the wall, and they looked at each other with the careful attention of 2 people who had both, by their respective roads, learned that looking carefully at what is actually present is rarer and more valuable than rank. His hand moved. It was a slight movement, his arm half extending. Not a reach, not a gesture, but the suggestion of one. And she crossed the 3 feet of frosted kitchen beds and put her hand in his, and he held it with the deliberate precision of a man who has decided something irrevocably. Neither of them spoke. The garden was cold, and the morning was gray, and the crows were loud in the ash trees beyond the wall. It was not a romantic scene in any of the ways she had ever been told romance looked. It was a kitchen garden in December, and they were standing in it, and she could feel the steady warmth of his hand in hers, and it was enough. It was, in fact, entirely enough. Lady Danforth departed the next morning. She said her farewells in the entrance hall with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has managed a campaign and accepted its outcome with the equanimity of someone who has other campaigns in progress elsewhere. She embraced Philippa with warmth and looked at the Earl of Wexford with an expression that mixed resignation and something that might, generously, have been called respect. She did not look at Agnes, who stood at a proper distance near the stair with Philippa's shawl and her own composed face. Miss Vivian Fox had very pretty manners and a very small smile when she said goodbye. Agnes felt for her, briefly and genuinely, because she was 22 and she had done nothing wrong, and the situation was not of her making. She inclined her head when Miss Fox passed her on the stair, and Miss Fox inclined hers in return, and that was all. After the carriage had gone, Philippa turned to her brother in the entrance hall and said, with the precision she always deployed when she was avoiding sentiment, "You might have handled that less abruptly." "I was not abrupt," he said. "You were very collected," Philippa said, which is nearly the same thing in company. She glanced at Agnes with the quick, acute look she used when she wanted you to know she understood more than she was saying. "Agnes, I shall need you in half an hour." "Yes, my lady," Agnes said. Philippa went upstairs. The Earl stood in the entrance hall a moment, and Agnes went to follow Philippa. And he said very quietly, "Miss Hartwell." She paused on the first step. She looked at him over her shoulder. He said, "I have written to my solicitor." She understood what this meant in the vocabulary of the household and its procedural grammar. She understood it as precisely what it was, not a declaration in the conventional sense, not the large gesture the season would have required from a man of his station, but something more deliberate, more permanent, more absolutely itself. The letter to the solicitor was the opening of a new chapter in the household's records, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it. "Thank you, my lord," she said. He nodded once, with the same measured acknowledgement he gave to everything that mattered, and she went upstairs. By Christmas, the arrangements were confirmed, and by the following March, a brief notice appeared in the county record that would have been unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it had cost and what it had survived to arrive there. Philippa was the first to embrace her when the notice was read aloud, fiercely and without ceremony. And then she stood back and looked at Agnes with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the world to make sense, and has, at last, received one confirming instance. Agnes wrote to her mother's old friend in Bath, who had loved her father and was still in sufficient health to read the letter and weep a little over it, very happily, and then fold it in her Bible where the important things were kept. She stood at the window of what was now her sitting room at Wexford Hall on the evening of the announcement, looking out at the park where the last snow of the winter was falling in soft, unhurried flakes across the bare ash trees, and she held in her hands the small, worn miniature her father had carried in his breast pocket for 30 years, showing her parents at their wedding, the paint rubbed thin at the edges, the faces almost soft with age. She had carried it since September. She had not known, until this moment, where it would finally rest. She set it on the mantelpiece, in the light of the fire, where she could see it. The snow came down across the park, and the ash trees stood in it, pale and patient, and entirely themselves. And Wexford Hall was warm at her back. She did not need to look behind her to know he was there. She had known since December that there was no going back from a kitchen garden in the frost. She had simply been waiting, as she always waited, for the world to catch up to what was already true. If Wexford Hall has stayed with you this evening, leave us a word in the comments. We are always here, and so is she.